Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz, and I'm the event coordinator at the bookstore. And I'm thrilled today to welcome Brandon Taylor to celebrate his book, Filthy Animals, in conversation with Adam Dalva. While the pandemic has taken a toll on all of our lives, events like the one that you're about to see here have been bright spots in our days. And I want to give a special thank you to our guests for joining us this evening. So, to some housekeeping, you should be able to see and hear our presenters, but they cannot see or hear you. So if you have any questions, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit them. We'll be asking those at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's also a chat button through which I'll be posting a link to buy tonight's book, which is very important. A caveat for tonight is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections and server loads, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We'll try to solve them quickly. And if you've scheduled, we've scheduled a whole host of summer programming for you. So please do head over to our website, sign up for our newsletter, stay up to date. One that in particular that I want to point out is next Thursday, July 8th. We're thrilled to be collaborating again with our friends at Harvard Bookstore, Politics and Prose, and Books and Books to welcome Michael Pollan for the release of his new book, This Is Your Mind on Plants, a radical challenge to how we think about drugs, in conversation with NPR's Alex Spiegel. That program is up on our website now and taking registrations. And finally, we've enabled Zoom's auto transcribe setting. So if your version of Zoom is up to date, you can hit the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable that. And now to a little about tonight's guests, and we'll get started. Brandon Taylor is the author of the acclaimed novel Real Life, which has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize, longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, and named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. He holds graduate degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the University of Iowa, where he was an Iowa Arts Fellow at the Iowa Writers Workshop in Fiction. And Adam Dalva's writing has appeared in the New York Review of Books, the Paris Review, and the Guardian. His graphic novel Olivia Twist was published by Dark Horse in 2019. Adam serves on the board of the National Book Critics Circle and is a book critic for Guernica magazine. He teaches creative writing at Rutgers University and is a graduate of NYU's Fiction MFA program, where he was a Veterans Writing Workshop Fellow, excuse me. So now without any further ado, I'll hand it off to you two, Brandon and Adam. Thank you so much.
Thank you. What a great intro.
Amazing. I didn't know you went to NYU. How cool.
Oh, we should have been doing more gossip in the green room even than we were.
I know.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're talking tonight about Filthy Animals. This is a fabulous, fabulous collection. And you know from DMing that I love this and that I'm not just saying it because we're in an event together. So I hope tonight we can bring this book to the audience and maybe unlock a few of its structural secrets and have a good conversation along the way. And maybe we were hoping, Brandon, would you start with like a little reading for us, perhaps?
Oh, sure. Yeah. This has been delightful. So I've been doing a bunch of these events lately, and it's been fun picking different stories to read. I guess for those who have sort of followed me from event to event, I won't read from the same story as I have been. So I'm going to be reading from a story in the middle of the book called Proctoring.
Yeah.
And what you need to know is that it's about a young man, Lionel, who is a proctor. And it's the morning after he went home with a ballet dancer who's got a girlfriend. So here we go from Proctoring. Lionel always felt a kind of secondhand embarrassment when he proctored exams. It was like visiting a friend's house during a family function, everyone behaving in a formal, context-determined way that at once applied to you as a guest, but also did not apply to you because you were not family, so the level of artifice was clear, yet you weren't supposed to comment on it. The department head was teaching an advanced seminar on early modern French history. Lionel's job was to write the prompt for the essay on the board, wait the 2 hours for the students to fill their blue books with everything they knew, and then deposit the blue books with the departmental secretary. It was as easy a chain of events as he could have asked for. He was late getting to the room in the basement of the art library and found the 15 white boys clustered in the hall, some standing and leaning against the wall, others on the floor, shuffling note cards, flicking them front to back. Their anxiety scuffed up the quiet. He let them into the room and wrote the prompt on the board, French absolutism. Then he wondered if he should have waited for them to seat themselves and put away their study materials. So he erased his writing, turned to them. He pulled up the PDF with the class roster and instructions and saw that he was supposed to have them sign in, but he had not gone to the departmental office to pick up the slip for them to sign. Does anyone have? He motioned as if to write on air, and one of the students, tallish in some sort of gray sweatsuit, ripped a sheet of paper from his notebook and held it out between two fingers. Lionel took the sheet and then, realizing that he'd forgotten to bring a pen, looked up and scribbled in the air again. The same boy rolled his eyes and offered Lionel his pen. Lionel took it, wrote the name and number of the course across the top of the sheet, then drew a line down the center and wrote two column headings, name and student ID number. And I'll stop there right before it gets into a discussion of like data security.
I like the conversation. There is always one student who is like, what about my data?
I mean, I've proctored a lot of exams, and you're right. There is always that one student who's like, "Are we doing this exactly?"
I mean, you know it from workshop, right? There's always a student who's like, what if this story leaks all over the internet from our workshop?
Oh my gosh, yeah. It's like you have other problems, friend.
Well, thank you for reading for us. I always think it's important to hear the voice of the author, and this is a beloved story of mine, proctoring. And astute listeners might have maybe picked up on something. Brandon read the first couple pages of proctoring. You can see that that's just where he started, but stuff had happened already. And so we come immediately to one of the oddities of this short story collection, which is that it is, if I'm saying this right, half of a linked story collection and half of standalone stories, with alternating linked stories making kind of a plot that threads through the book. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that decision, because it's funky.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very chaotic choice. Yeah, so as Adam said, the book is made up of 11 stories, about half of which follow this trio of characters, Lionel, Charles, and Sophie. It starts with Lionel meeting these two dancers who are in an open relationship at a potluck that he has come to because he's recently gotten out of the hospital following a psychiatric stay. And so he meets them at this potluck, and then the stories sort of follow them as they become increasingly involved with each other across a few snowy nights and days in Madison, Wisconsin. And then there are what I call the interstitial stories, which sit between each entry in that linked story cycle. And the way that they all came to inhabit the same book is that the Lionel Charles Sophie stories used to live in a different book, and the interstitial stories lived in a book called Filthy Animals. And just like over the course of living and thinking, I realized that those two books should probably be one book. And then it became this process of like trying to house break the stories so that they would get along in the same manuscript. And I tried a few different configurations. Like I first tried leaving those linked stories together, and I tried putting all five of them back to back to back at the start of the book, then at the end of the book, then in the middle of the book, and like it just never quite worked. It just felt too dense and too unprocessed. And then I thought, okay, like what if I like shuttle between the linked story narrative and the interstitial stories and use those unlinked stories as like modulations, and tried it out, and it seems like really obvious now, but it was not obvious to me at the time because I didn't know you could do that. Like I thought if you had a linked stories collection, it had to be like a linked story collection. But like I immediately just like really loved the rhythm of the storytelling of entering this book with Lionel, Charles, and Sophie, then coming out of that story, then going back in and then coming out, and then getting to visit these other characters and other tonalities. And it made a lot of sense to me, and it just felt right. And so I was like, I hope they'll let me do this. I don't know. I don't want to go to, I don't know. Phil Klein someone made this joke of like, well, you didn't want to go to short story jail. And I was like, no, I did not want to go to short story jail.
A brutal place, if I hear correct.
Don't break the rules.
But one thing that I think makes sense here is that the non-linked stories kind of do work together and also amplify emotion, violence, pain, suffering. There are like linkages otherwise. So were you, as you were sort of massaging this into one collection, thinking of a kind of cohesive emotional whole? Because it's very emotionally kind of intact.
Yeah, I mean, so like when I write stories, I'm always aware of the sort of larger manuscript picture. And in fact, I can't write stories unless I'm writing them into a manuscript.
Hmm.
And so for this book, the challenge was, once I sort of decided that I was going to have two species of stories, the linked stories and the unlinked stories, then it was just a matter of finding the ones that seemed to fit. And so like this book has changed a lot over the years. You know, like some stories have gone into the book, some stories have come out of the book. And the sort of final configuration I landed on was, it really felt like, so two of the stories in the book I wrote while I was an MFA student in Iowa. And it just felt like those two stories belonged to this book, even though most of the stories in the book predate them by like many, like 5 years.
Mhm.
And so once I sort of found the right configuration, the ones that sort of made the most sense for the artistic whole of the thing, it just, then it was a matter of like revising the stories I had put into the book. Although, and listen, I tried to take stories out of this book, and it got to a certain point where my editor was like, no, they stay. You can revise them, you could change them, but we're not taking any more stories out. We're not putting any more in. Like it these are the right stories.
But
And
I feel
they,
like my like digital arc is like a collector's item. It's a little different than the final version I have in my hands today.
I think it might, yeah, it's quite different. It is quite different. Yeah, I mean, and that's just because it just felt like the stories weren't fully cooked yet. Like
Mhm.
there was still things that I felt insecure about in the stories, and I was like, you know, my editor let me basically tear up a story in first pass pages and rewrite it, which I didn't know was allowed. And honestly,
You're breaking all sorts of rules.
I think honestly it might not be allowed. Although he did say to me, and I swear that he was just saying this to like comfort me, but he was like, tearing up a short story in first pass pages is not the worst thing a writer can do. And I'm just like, Cal, I feel like that's not true. I feel like you're just trying to make me feel better about this whole process, because I sense that it is one of the more chaotic things a writer could do.
He didn't say chaotic, he said worst.
That's true. You know what? That's true. Yeah.
I think chaos is a little good. Well, it doesn't show. I mean, that's what's so interesting about this. It feels so. We have this trio at the center of the link stories, and I wanted to kind of ask about dance, because you have this kind of dance aspect that kind of flows through the book, as opposed to your wonderful novel, A Real Life, where there's a strong kind of science basis. There's a very strong dance basis, and we don't spend much time, although Lionel's a mathematician, we don't spend much time except in his abstract kind of musings in the math world. We spend time in the dance world. And I was thinking about pairs and trios and sort of unbalanced duos and cross-gender duos and trios. And it just seemed like you were working with a kind of characters like a choreographer might work with their dancers.
That's really kind of you. That big if true. I would love that to be the case. I mean, I think that I'm just like a person who's like naturally drawn to relationships. I think Sally Rooney once said something like that she doesn't write characters, she writes relationships. She doesn't really understand a character until they're in a dynamic with someone else. And I feel very similar. Like I am interested in character, but like I'm mostly interested in character under the particular pressures and tensions of being in relation to another person. And so yeah, I mean, I love approaching story through a relationship. And one of my thesis advisors, Tom Drury, he said to me, "You have a lot of stories about relationships, but you only have one love story, and that love story is Anne of Cleves." And I think, I mean, he's right, he is correct. But I think that as a writer, I am drawn to relationships, and I think that it's also true that a lot of choreography centers on human relationships and centers on duos, and there's always a tension, like in a pas de deux, for example, like there is something intrinsically tense about that. And yeah, I mean, I love, and honestly, like putting this book together, like when you have a book of stories that are all fundamentally about relationships, you've got to spend a lot of time thinking about like what you're doing
Yeah.
with the structure of relationships in each story, so that each one stands apart, or where they are similar, it adds something and deepens a theme or a note or a module. But yeah, I'm always writing about relationships and trying to work through existential questions through our relationships, because I think that's how we as humans spend a lot of our time, honestly.
I would say so. um,
Perhaps all of our time is spent that way, one might say.
I think that's part of what we're doing here right now, isn't it?
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah. So I think like when I think about moral fiction, which is something you give in a wonderful interview, you talked about kind of D.H. Lawrence and moral fiction. And one thing about your interpersonal relationships, they have like these sudden fissures and over. And I'm not like a huge, like I want to spoil the whole book for the audience, but I will say that a lot of these stories take sudden turns, sudden, abrupt shifts in register, shifts in violence, shifts in sexuality. And I was wondering, often I found myself loving a character like Sophie, and then all of a sudden being like, do I like this person? And so I was sort of shifting my book club brain of like, do you like this character or not? I would think a book club would kind of have like a fun time with this because the characters are so shifting in their likability, quote unquote, which is a word I hate, but I think is also an important word to think about this book.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that is interesting that you say that, because I didn't. So, like, I'm never aware of that. Like, although a lot of reviewers and the few negative reviews I've gotten in my life, they all, even with real life, they all boil down to that particular thing where it's like there are a lot of sudden changes in these characters and their relationships, and I'm like, yeah, like that.
Feature,
Like,
not bug.
I mean, that's kind of how it. That's how I kind of how I experience relationships, and yeah, to your point about there being these like moments where a character sort of, the ground beneath their feet cracks open and they don't even know, like, oh, I loved you, but now you have betrayed me in a way I did not see coming, and it wrongfoots the character who experiences it. And like, yeah, I do think that that can feel very disorienting and very sudden, but it's always my hope that like when the reader goes back to read the story back through, they see how it was always you were always on precarious ground in some ways. But I love writing those sudden shifts in a relationship, those sudden shifts in momentum when a person reveals themselves in a way that you just like did not see coming, and it turns out that they aren't who you thought they were. And moments where a character betrays their intentions without meaning to, and it's really, can you perceive the signals that they've been sending perhaps by accident. And I think that that's a part of just living in the matrix of human relation, I think. And any sort of attempt to capture that in a realistic way has to, if you're writing authentically about human relationships, there are going to be surprises and fault lines and places where a character is likable and places where a character is kind of a jerk. And I think we all know people like that, and indeed we all kind of are people like,
Kind
like that.
of.
I mean, but it is interesting. I think likability. I think a lot of literary writers always like, I don't care about likability, da da da, and I'm like, okay, but have you spoken to a person on an airplane about a book? Well, because
Right.
most people care about
Explain.
likability. It's like an intrinsic part of reading literature. And I do think I mean, I would hope that a book club would have fun with
Oh, I
that.
think
But
so.
but I sense that for the most part they would be like, what do you mean this character we liked at the beginning we don't like at the end? I think they would have a problem with that. I think they would. I think in theory they might have a problem with that. But I love a character who changes.
I did. And when they change, now this is maybe the big like ghost of writing question. Do they surprise you?
Often, I am often surprised, and sometimes when I'm writing a scene and I can feel the scene building towards something, but the scene ends before the thing that I felt coming, like before it gets there, I'm like, okay, so I have like miswired something somewhere in this scene and I have to go back and rewrite it. But I'm always, I my characters do surprise me, and I'm always trying to be receptive to places where they can surprise me. And I think that oftentimes what I see as an editor and as a teacher of creative writing, I think oftentimes writers feel like they're about to be surprised by a character and they suppress it by ejecting from the scene, or having the character go around the thing that would surprise them, and that's to preserve a sense of order and control. And I think like I'm always trying to write into that place. I'm always trying to write into the surprise and to steer into the skid and to not shut things down just because I'm getting uncomfortable as a writer. I'm always seeking discomfort and surprise in writing.
One thing that puts me in mind of, I was very upset when I was watching your very excellent launch with Christian Lorenzen, because I had this beautiful question for you and he just stepped all over it. And I actually turned it off. I was so if I've asked other questions that he asked, don't tell me. I was just like, hell no, Christian Lorenzen. But as I was preparing for this event, I was also reading the stories of Cheever and thinking of that kind of like traditional mode. And one thing that he does a lot, and I think Gallant also, but Cheever to me, is have a very sort of slow build and then a sudden, like a ski lift kills a kid or something like that. That's not like an abstract hypothetical, like a ski lift just like kills a kid. And so I was thinking that it's in a way this kind of wonderful model where you have like place setting and object work and the slow build and then this sudden gesture in some way. And are you thinking as you write of like crescendo and building and giving yourself the objects you need later in a story in that kind of realist tradition?
I think what I'm trying to do, I think yes, and I think I am trying to attend to those things, but not in a direct way. I think because if I think it's Flannery O'Connor who says that if you put a wooden leg in a story, it first and foremost has to function as a wooden leg before it can accrue meaning, and that objects in stories do not have any meaning if you just put them there as like a tool to use. They have to first have some sort of concrete physical meaning in the world of the story itself. And so I'm always trying to like pay attention to the stuff I introduce into the story and then trying to make sure that those things accrue meaning, through the sort of arc or motion of the story. And like always trying to make sure that I'm bringing along the things that I need. So if I write a story that's like I recently just finished revising a story that takes place at a bonfire. And it opens with the bonfire kind of like not well made and it's sort of like puttering. And I didn't know that I was gonna like have a character do something to that fire. I was just like, there's a fire, but of course college kids don't really know how to do a fire. They're in the Midwest. All their parents are professors. They've never started a fire before. And then I had my character then interact with the fire in a way that was like resonant and significant to him. But like that's not I didn't introduce that fire pit to do that. I just introduced a fire pit because it's a bonfire. And then I had my character interact with it over the course of the story in a way that sort of accrued meaning to him. So I'm always trying to build to that place where the pressure of a story causes a phase change almost in
Mm.
the objects, and everything becomes charged and does attain, a sort of poetic resonance. But I don't think you can do that stuff intentionally. I think it has to come naturally through the gravity of the story.
Well, you say gravity and you have like one of the great objects, which is a ruler holding up a window. Uh, that is my favorite object, I think, in a story is the glass bowl in Panin, and he's washing it and he's worried he's going to break it. And the bowl has memory in it, right? And this ruler, so Lionel is, as you said, suffering, has temporarily dropped out. The ruler of his math program, the ruler is like a representative of that. It's also like a very old object. It also is holding up a window and then it shatters because it fails. So I was interested in how you used small things, small objects to like thrust us back in time. And you go back in time like suddenly. You could be like mid-paragraph sometimes. You can like launch with it. And often I found you doing it with objects or like mishaps and things like that. So I was wondering about the presence of the past. And I think that's a particularly charged question with the linked collection, because every story, if you're reading this in a great magazine like Guernica or something, I think Guernica published Anne of Cleves, let's pretend they published one of the Lionel stories. You need to set up the previous action, but you don't want the people reading the collection to be like, oh, I know this already. So I was wondering about like how you handled the past, which you gave yourself a complex assignment with exposition, is basically what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that I wrote those stories before I went to Iowa. So, like, I wrote the Lionel Charles Sophie stories 2016. I wrote them before I wrote real life. I wrote them before I even knew how to be a writer. I sort of wrote them out of this like very instinctual place of like basically I wrote them having taught myself to write stories by reading Mavis Gallant and Ann Beattie, which are great writers to read if you need to figure out how to do like exposition very efficiently. But then I got to Iowa and I had all this like creative writing stuff shoved at me. And so then I went back to revise those stories and I'm like, suddenly I knew like, oh, this is backstory. This is exposition. And so I had this whole complex. And I just like do not think that I could have written those stories now. Like I think because I just would have I would have been aware of how complicated the whole thing was. But when I wrote those stories, I didn't know anything. So I was like, and then he's gonna have a memory. That's great. But now I'm over here like death to all backstory as a writer. I'm just like death to backstory. But I think that part of for example, part of why real life is structured the way it is because I love backstory. I love exposition. I love it like it's going out of business. Like it's just I cannot get enough. And so I in that novel I gave myself this assignment of like writing a novel with no backstory and like putting it in the middle. But with these stories, the backstory is there and it has to be there because you need to know, for example, that Lionel tried to kill himself. And you need to know very quickly like what he did and how he went to the hospital and all that other stuff. But it can't overwhelm the present story. It's gotta like function and get out of the way. And so when I'm writing, I'm always like looking for little places where I can dip into the past in a way that like deepens your sense of the present and like what is happening in the present, but to stop talking about the past the minute I feel like, okay, the reader's like, where are we? The minute the reader's like, is this scene in the past or is this scene now?
Yeah, there's none of that. It's really clear.
Well, thank you. Well, it was a lot of just like my own natural intolerance for exposition and backstory. Like I love to write it, but as a reader, I'm like, the clock is ticking. So as a reader, I'm really impatient with it. And so that the reader brain had to sort of teach my writer brain how to not waste the reader's time. But the past, I think the past is such an important texture for a story, especially a short story. I mean, short stories kind of live and die by the past and the writer's ability to manage that information.
And I mean, short stories are fabulous. We love them. And the chat is mentioning, please submit your questions to the Q&A. We'll be getting to them in about 15 minutes, and we're looking forward to that. These are great short stories. You wrote a wonderful novel. How different is your approach when you go into a short story in a novel? Are you thinking same kind of Brandon at his desk doing a thing? Are you thinking different forms of arrangement, different forms of energy? How do you go about that difference?
Yeah, I mean, for one, I feel more comfortable in the story. I don't have any story baggage. I sit down to write a story. Stories are just easier for me. That's just the form I feel more at ease in. But for me, it's a little complicated because, as I said, I never write really like truly standalone stories. I'm always like working on a manuscript or I'm not writing. Like this story is either going to be in a book or I'm just not going to write it. Like I can't even start writing a story until I have a sense of like the 4 or 5 stories that will follow it. And so in that sense, it's like very similar to novel writing. And I have all these like weird technical habits. So like I write in order, chronological. I don't skip around. I don't like writing a lot of backstory or flashback. Like I don't do that. And so like when I hop into and like a lot of my stories tend to be like these one scene stories, these sort of long, sort of spongy scene stories. And I do that in novels too. And so it looks very similar.
Okay.
It looks so similar because I have all these like strong opinions. Like I'll never write first person fiction and I'll never, I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to write in fragments. Like that's just not I don't believe in play is I think what it boils down to. I know there are a lot of writers who are like play is like so important and I am just not doing that.
No hijinks. No hijinks. Oh.
Although like I say that and people keep being like this book is so structurally weird. I'm like, is it structurally strange? And then I'm like,
it's a little.
I mean, it is. Frank, like, it is. Like, also, the novel, also structurally weird. Like, real
Yeah,
life is a weird book.
weird book.
And so, like, in my mind, I'm like very sort of Protestant and severe. But when you go to the tape reveals a much
Your
stranger set
hands
of
are clapping a bit too much during the song.
yeah, it becomes, I think the tape reveals a set of much stranger sort of narrative impulses. But for me, the process looks very similar, although I never have this thing of like, I didn't know I was writing a novel. That is not a thing I experience because I'm like, I know the shape and the form of the thing that I am working on.
You like a quick one-line paragraph and then a two-page paragraph. So I think you get a little looser than you want to admit here.
Listen, it's whatever moves me in the moment. I do love a good one sentence paragraph. It's like a knife stab, like a one sentence paragraph, one of our great unheralded
I
narrative
just literally
forms.
just flipped to fucking Idaho, which is one of my favorite. That's a little funky. I refuse to accept that there's not a little play going on in this thing.
There's a lot of cackling, but there isn't a lot of like, I'm gonna write a story from the perspective of an upside down moose. Like I just simply would never do that.
Someone in the audience just tore up their manuscripts.
I mean, I would read a story about an upside down moose. Yeah.
Way to salvage it. So, okay, this book is very funny. Now, I think when people talk about this book, they're gonna be drawn to you deal with difficult issues of mental health. There is sexual violence. There is straight up violence. There is memories of abuse. All along, you're making jokes. All along, you're having fun. I felt like a looseness, and this was true in both. Just thinking of like the chronology of you writing this in the earlier stories, but also in the stories we talked about last, the kind of unlinked stories, you will turn and find a joke at kind of unexpected moments when you're writing, and that sometimes I think is an underrated skill. And writers, have you ever read a book that you like and you're just like, why isn't this just a tiny bit funny on top of all the other things about it?
Absolutely. Like, yeah. You can tell when a book takes itself just like slightly too seriously, and it's like, why is this so ponderous?
But your book has heavier, more serious, weighty topics than 95% of books I read. And it's also really funny a lot. And I was wondering about the role of humor in your writing, because I think it's something that I don't see written about you very often. Is I'm always drawn to it.
Yeah, I think people tend to take me very seriously, which I appreciate as an artist, but I do think like there is a lot of humor. I mean, I crack myself up, especially like when I'm writing dialogue. I'm laughing. Like
Yeah.
laugh a lot while writing dialogue, and I always think about Laurie Moore, who's like a very important writer for me, and also Anne Beattie, who is much funnier than people give her credit for, and also Mavis Gallant. But like the great thing about like Laurie Moore, for example, I think about her great story Community Life, which is about this woman who's like from
Amazing.
Transylvania, and like the whole first couple pages is just like a series of puns about her being from Transylvania and working in a library, and her parents dying, and that story is so full of jokes, even as all these awful things are happening to this character. Like her parents are dead, her boyfriend cheats on her maybe, and she doesn't feel taken seriously by the world, and then it ends in this really horrifying but also kind of absurd funny way that's like also really emotional and really moving. And like I that's what I'm always trying to do in a story, is trying to sort of open my arms and sort of encompass the full range of human experience and expression. And the way that I think about humor is I think about it in the context of jokes. So like to me, a joke is like a trick. It's like a thing that's funny. But to me, humor is like a system of intelligence. Like it's a way of understanding and extracting meaning from the world and from a set
Hmm.
of circumstances. And so humor to me is kind of also just like a weather system that just like hangs around a story. And being Southern, like you laugh at really awful things all the time in the South. Like it's just a thing. Um, so I think many of my characters, they have a sensibility that's kind of akin to mine, which is that life is often the funniest at its bleakest and most
Mhm.
absurd. Like it's often funniest when you're like in the example of As Though That Were Love in this book.
Yeah.
The main character Hart just is like having a conversation about how his mother died, and he's like trying to sort of break through to his friend Simon, and his friend Simon's like making all these horrible, all these horrible jokes.
It's like my mom died, and Simon's just like joking around.
Yeah, I mean, he's like, so I heard, and all this other stuff, and and I just think that humor. It's not that the humor is there to like lighten the load of all the
Yeah.
serious stuff, but to me, the humor is there as a way of extracting another layer of meaning from all that stuff. It's not there to sort of cut through like all the brutality and the pain. Like to me, it's not even really truly working counter to that stuff. It's a way of like further processing it in some way. So I think the humor is really important to understanding what's happening to the characters.
That was what I was noting and loving is like you can laugh, but you know that the characters are often covering something up or like have some stuntedness that they're trying to desperately to like paper over whenever.
Deflecting left and
Yeah.
right.
And we know that is a personality type, and it's something like a kind of wry deadpan kind of thing that does a lot for a character. Laurie Moore was my workshop teacher, and sometime when it's not your day, I'll tell you some good stories.
Oh, please do. I love her work so much. Birds of America is one of the
Amazing.
great books of
Amazing.
our time. Like it's so brilliant. It's so and like heart wrenching. Like oh my god.
Terrible.
Anyway, we listen. Dancing in America. Wow.
One time I brought in a kiss. I wrote a kiss, and I was like, the kiss was warm and soft, and she crossed it out and wrote chapped and spicy in the margin instead. I was like, that's the Laurie Moore thing.
That is so incredible. Wow. I'm
I
gonna
know.
redo all my kissing in the book now.
Chapped. I'll feel very honored when there's chapped kisses all over your next.
Oh my god, that's incredible. What an incredible little anecdote.
Just a little bite size. Now back to you.
Mhm.
You have great party scenes, and I have heard many writers say that a party scene undoes them. I think the hardest thing in writing is getting characters into and out of cars. I think that you actually do that too. That's very hard. But party scenes are all, how do you get them out of a car? I want to ask you that also. But party scenes here, you have overheard dialogue. The book opens with the longest story, Potluck, which is a 40-page potluck. And you have all these interpersonal dynamics. What's your approach to writing party scenes? How do you kind of spin them out?
That is kind of amazing. So I will say, I know that the first story is very long, but I did not mean it to be. It was only 30 pages when I turned it in, and it somehow turned into a quite long story. And I'm like, oh my god, no one's gonna read this book. Yeah. So I love social scenes because, especially parties, because parties are like one of the great locked boxes of narrative. Like when people show up at a party, you're kind of agreeing to the social contract to be there for at least like 30 minutes. And so like a lot can happen in 30 minutes, especially like with all these people showing up with all their differing and competing agendas and like scene and like parties are great because they force you to write in scene. They force you to like hang with characters. And if a character's gonna leave a party, like they've got to like leave the party, which means that they have to sort of interact with people to extract themselves. And so like even in trying to like get a character out of a party, they've got to interact with all these people in all these different ways. And so I just like as a site of social collision and human drama, I think a party is fantastic. And my approach is literally just to like write them. I think where people really struggle is that people don't like to write scenes and they don't like to stay in scenes. They want to just write their character vapor and have it drift through 3 rooms and then throw down an asterisk and then you're writing the next day. Like the thing about a party scene is that it forces you to have to contend with the reality of the world that you have created. And that world then
Mm.
gets to put pressure back on your character. And I think people just get really uncomfortable with that. They get uncomfortable when the world of the story pushes back. And like what is a party if not the world of the story pushing back? So I
Yeah.
just think people got to get comfortable writing scenes.
I'm not going to
Forget
follow up on the asterisk, but that was very funny.
I know. I mean, it's true though. Like, how many party scenes have you read where like the character just like stands in a corner and then it's like he felt uncomfortable, so he went home. And I'm just like, you've just copped out of like a really rich set of social interactions and narrative.
There's always a music description where they do that. It's like, here's a corner and here's the music that's playing. Okay, I'm leaving.
And it's always the music's always like rendered like slightly ironically also. Like,
Slightly
I have
ironically.
a whole list of pet peeves about party scenes, but my solution for writing party scenes is just to like stay in scene. Like, even if you end up writing a bunch of stuff that you're going to take out eventually, at least give yourself the opportunity to like put some words down in scene, characters interacting and having to push back against each other. I think that's really the site of a lot of discomfort in fiction
You
writing.
linger,
I
and
love to linger.
I think of I think of it like, you know, when you're watching the play and the characters, the lights go back up and they've just kind of rearranged themselves, but the set's the same and they're still there. And oh my God, that's always amazing. And it's awkward often.
Yeah, yeah. I think people just get uncomfortable having, like, they're comfortable having their characters say things, but they're not comfortable having to think of a reply or
Mhm.
having to sort of let their characters' actions and words have effects and consequences in scene. They're chill just to like throw down some dialogue and then have their character go to the bathroom or something, and then they go home and then they've written a party scene. You know, like it's I think people just have to get comfortable being uncomfortable and seen and writing through the discomfort, writing through their set of received scripts and ideas about what a scene can do, and getting to some place that is like on the other side of their capacity, like getting to the place where you are just like, I have no idea what's going to happen next. Like
Mhm.
that is when you have gotten to the right place in a scene. That's when you've gotten far. That's when you've gotten to the right beginning place. Is when you don't know what will happen next. When it is that high wire act, and I think that's crucial in all good writing. But it is like the only way to write a party scene, like any kind of social interaction.
I love that. And I hope aspiring writers think about that. And I love the straw man we're building who fails at all these tests.
Listen,
And I know the straw man. Now, before we throw it to the audience, one thing I loved about your party scene, and this will sort of explode into the whole collection, this question. You have two vegetarians. They have different systems of their vegetarianism. They're kind of mocked in different ways. I was amazed and struck by the omnipresence of food in this collection, the delicate preparations of food. And this is something that comes up in Little Beast, which is one of the Unlinked collections, stories which I love, about sort of someone who's working as a cook part-time. It comes up in What Made Them Made You. It comes up in Anne of Cleves. It comes up all over this. And the intimate gestures of food preparation, coffee preparation, these were things that you were doing. I was wondering about this sort of method you were approaching there because I found it fascinating.
yeah, I think what comes through in those gestures and moments in the book is my sort of unending love of just like process. Like I just love when people do stuff. Like in my reading life, I read many books that I really love, but what I miss is just like a sense of like being present with a character in a scene while they're like doing stuff. And
Mhm.
like the way that someone makes coffee tells you so much about them. Like it tells you so much. And I just love writing about food, and I love writing about characters making things with their hands. And I love writing about people who are making things with their hands for someone else
Mm.
to take care and to love them and to show them affection and love, even in times when they can't sort of verbally express it. And so I think that I just try to attend to all the physical realities of a character's life and to let that fill the story, to make the story feel like its own world in a sense. And
But then meat, which is a name, one of your story titles, but also there's multiple hunters in this collection. So there's like
yeah.
a violence with food also. And that just reminded me of the turn that happens in some of these stories. There's like an inherent violence to a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, well, I also grew up shooting and field dressing animals as a child. I
Mhm.
grew up on a farm in rural Alabama, and it just felt like, a friend asked me that question too. They were like, "Why are there so many like, why are people always like killing animals in your stories?" And I'm just like, "Well, I grew up on a farm, killing
Mhm.
animals. It's just like what you do. It's like part of life." And they're like, "But that's so violent." And I'm like, "Well, so is the police state we live in." Like, so, like, I mean, welcome
I'm
to the
sure your friend
world.
loved
It's like
that.
welcome to the world, friend.
Absolutely.
And honestly, I will say like the reason that I wrote the story as though that were love was that all these people, all these like middle class college people in Iowa City were trying to lecture me about like loving animals and why did I feel like all this stuff. And I'm like, you let your dog lick you in the mouth as though that's love. Like
Oh yeah.
Like, why are you trying to tell me how to live my life? And so like that story is written very much as like a middle finger to like liberal elite smugness, re animal cruelty. But
When he thinks that he taught his animals to hunt and that was real love. I think that's one of the like standout sentences in the whole book and could be like one of your theses. That
I mean,
real love that.
I do think a lot about that. The idea that love can look different depending on your value system, and sometimes one of the great discomforts of life is realizing that your value system is in conflict with the
Mhm.
world that you thought you wanted to be a part of, and suddenly you're like, oh, I don't fit here. Oh no, what do I do? The sort of, I think that's one of the great traumas that haunt this book. Like one of the big traumas in this book is a character realizing like the world they thought they loved does not love them back, nor will it ever.
I think that happens more than once if I'm kind of thinking about it, doesn't
Honestly,
it?
it's literally the epigraph of the book. Like it's in almost every story. And I didn't realize that until I had sort of turned it in. I was like, huh, that book is full of characters who love a world and tried to attain it, but once they attained it, it didn't love them back. That's weird. I wonder why I'm so drawn to that as an idea.
I love that. I'm gonna get to Q&A. I just before I do, and we have 5 questions. I'm excited to get to them. I just want to say for readers, this book has an incredible ending, and I don't want Brandon to even spoil it, but there is like maybe a 5-page sequence at the end of this thing that's like crazy good, like crazy, crazy, crazy good. Um, I'll say it involves haircutting. That's all I'm gonna say, and it is so sharp. So stick with it till the end.
I'm so glad you felt that way. My editor and I had many long conversations about some of the conversations that they have in the last pages of the book because it was so important to get it right. Like a lot rides on those last like 3 or 4 pages. Like it so much needs to happen there, and we had back and forths about it, and I feel in my heart that it is the right place. And before we get to the Q&A, I just want to say like I read those final pages like to my friend because I was like, so much is important. Will you tell me if I've like totally botched this? And I read him the last little bit of the book, and he's like, that's exactly right. Like
This
that
is
is exactly right. And I was like, okay, it doesn't matter if everyone hates it. My friend for whom I wrote this book thinks that I got it totally right.
your
So
friend is a good reader. Your
I
friend is.
agree. I agree. He's been there since the very first story I ever wrote, so he
Oh,
knows. He knows the whole
that's
deal.
amazing. Sometimes a friend's been there since the first story and isn't so helpful. So you're very lucky.
Yeah, in so many ways. Yeah. I This book and real life were thrown in the trash, and another friend literally took them out of the trash can and told me I could have them back when I had earned them. So I have been very
Wow.
lucky with friends.
That's like the coolest thing I've ever heard anyone say.
I feel really lucky to have had friends who believed in me and nurtured my work. It's the luckiest thing in the world.
I love that. Now I'm going to start going through the Q&A. We have a comment that says there is a chapped kiss in Filthy Animals. Lori Moore would be proud.
Yes.
Yes, you did it. And now I have, okay, I'm going to read these. This one looks like it's fishing for tea, and you can dish it up however you like. You mentioned your very few negative reviews, but what are some of the more surprising reviews or reactions you've gotten for this book?
Hmm. I think I mean I will say like the negative reviews were fine. I
That's a
think
writer.
the most surprising thing has just been that people are so willing to sort of follow these stories into like the very dark recesses of these characters' lives. I really thought like I was gonna get canceled for the title story especially, but
Really?
yeah. But people have been so generous to this book, and they've been so willing to meet it on its own terms, and that to me has been like the really surprising part. It's just how generous readers have been with this book because it's not an easy book. Like it is not, and like people hate short stories out there in the streets, and so the fact that people have been so willing to read this book and to meet it on its own terms and to wrestle with the things it asks of the reader. I mean, it's just been amazing. It's been so incredibly amazing. So that's the part I'm always surprised by, that readers are willing to let these characters into their lives, even if they don't like it. but most people have. So I will say even the negative ones have been very kind and generous.
Well, that's great. And I have a little follow up to that, which is that I've enjoyed in the interviews I've read, and people tell you their favorite story. And that's something people are not going to be like, I love chapter 6 of Real Life or something like that, right?
People do say that. People are
Oh,
like,
that's good.
well, it's because it's the one with all the black trauma. They're like, I love
That is a
section
good
5
chapter.
of Real Life. It was so amazing.
That is
You
an
know?
amazing chapter.
Well, thank you. I did not write for many
Incredible.
weeks after I wrote it.
Oh
But
my
yeah,
God.
I mean, people love to tell me that they loved chapter 5 of Real Life. And it's always that one. It's always that chapter that they love. And it's always the lab chapter they hate. Yeah.
Well, the lab chapter, I mean, he got fucked. Anyway, I felt so bad for him. But is it fun for you to have readers say, like, I like this? Are you surprised by the favorite stories? Do you have a favorite child in this thing?
Well, I think for the most part, people love Anne of Cleves because it's like
And
the
good.
one optimistic story. Although people have really liked What Made Them Made You, which I found really surprising because that story gave me so much trouble. But no, I love hearing what people's favorites are. It's always delightful because it's never, I mean, it's usually Anne of Cleves or something I never saw coming.
I love that you put the pleaser so late in the collection. It's story 8 out of 11.
Well, there, it was going to be somewhere else, but like because What Made Them Made You and Mass can't be too close
Yeah,
together, like it,
of course. And that would be
yeah,
a spoiler to talk about why.
I know.
Okay, next question. When you're writing, who or what do you like to read, and is there anything you avoid?
Hmm. I don't tend to avoid much, but that's just because the books that I am drawn to when I'm writing are just like so. So the thing that I do most when I'm writing, when I'm actively drafting, I listen to the audiobook of Persuasion and Sense and Sensibility and The Price of Salt, and I basically just like listen to them constantly,
Oh my
constantly,
gosh, I love
constantly,
it.
constantly. And I like listen to an audiobook of like a really dense historical biography, but the novels that I return to are always Persuasion, Sense and Sensibility, and The Price of Salt. And sometimes like some Miley Malloy. Like I love her
Ooh.
stories so much, but yeah, I tend not to avoid things. But it's just because I'm always listening to the same novels. Those are that's basically all I listen to.
The concussion scene in Persuasion is like maybe my favorite turn in a book.
It is so weird and so good. I love it so much.
Was on it that day. That was like 2 Benadryl a day for Miss Austen.
Agree. 1000%. I think I also stole that for the title story. But anyway, for reasons that will become clear to anyone who reads this book, they will recognize the parallels.
I hadn't put it together till you said it, and it's amazing.
Yeah. Jane Austen gets in there all the time. She's in all of my work so deeply.
She's I can see that. She also could handle a party scene pretty well.
Yes.
Now next. And I think we kind of talked about this a bit, but I'm sure there'd be a little more here. It sounds like this book was in the works before Real Life. Is that correct?
Yeah, I wrote this book. So the title story, What Made Them Made You, and Little Beast were done in August of 2016, and then I wrote the Lionel Charles Sophie stories over like basically a week, um, right around the election in 2016.
Oh,
And so the first drafts of the bulk of the book was done by 2016, and then it was reworked many times over the last 5 or so years.
you write fast.
Yes,
And then
I've
you
learned.
find you need like a recharge time after you write really fast and really hard.
It's strange. Like with short stories, not usually, but like after I wrote Real Life, I didn't write for like 9 months. But when I write stories, I tend to just churn them out. Once I get in a groove, I tend to write them very quickly on each other's heels, and then I'll take like a couple months off. You sometimes, but the refractory period for novel writing is much greater for me. I have found.
It's really interesting. Now, next question. The way you talk about characters and scenes and human drama, I wonder if you've written any drama or plan to.
No, I don't think that I have. I mean, like the screenplay for Real Life, but like that is different. Um, I, I do, I, I have not written any drama, but I love drama. I love learning about drama in undergrad was like a real sort of eye-opening moment for me. Like first
Hmm.
studying Chekhov and Lorca and um, some of Turgenev's dramatic work, like reading all that stuff was so important. And Stanislavski, of course, and Brecht and Ionesco, all that stuff was so just like it was like getting struck by lightning every time I went to class, and so that stuff is so deeply in my conception of how to render narrative that it's in there. But no, I've not yet written a play. I don't think I have that brain, but I would love to one day grow up to be a playwright.
My first like hoot when I was reading this is quote, "Is your heart's desire to interrogate strangers at a dinner party like a Chekhov character?" That's a great line.
Thank you. Late breaking addition to the book.
You're like stopping the press, like jamming it in.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was a lot of fun to. Yeah, I love, and I think that's why I love dialogue so much. It's just that it's like getting to write like a little mini play. It's yeah, it's so much fun.
Okay, I like that. Ooh, here's a good question. I enjoy interlinked short stories. Do you enjoy writing linked short stories or short stories that stand alone more?
I mean, I don't know that I write truly standalone stories because I'm always writing in constellations of characters, and so the narrative linkages might or might not be there. I love following a cast of characters around and around and around and
Hmm.
around. And I can't stop doing that. I love doing that sort of thing. And so I love linked stories. I think that all my stories ultimately end up sharing the same universe and backdrop. So yeah, I love linked stories more. Even my standalone stories, like if you look hard enough, there's always like a little Easter egg from some of the other stories.
So are
So
you going to be like Zola or Balzac? Is it all going to connect at the end?
well, the first four books definitely, and the sixth and seventh maybe. But yeah, there's a connected universe that will become clear, I think, as readers go on. But it makes sense. I love Zola. Listen, if I could write like 20 books in the same cycle, absolutely.
I read
Could
the
there
masterpiece over the weekend. That book slaps hard.
the opening of that book is so absurd.
Fucking lightning bolt across
it's
the sky.
it's basic. I have this theory that it's basically a romance novel opening, but I won't. We'll
Oh,
DM
it
about
is.
that
It's
later.
like the most dreamy romance novel for like 80 pages, and he can't keep it up after that. He is
Yeah, then it gets very Zola-y. Yeah, for sure.
the despair. From painting to dance. I would love to know if you've observed dancers closely in real life or in the studio.
No, but the impulse to write the linked stories in this book happened because I was on YouTube one snowy night in lab and I came across like this video from World Ballet Day, which is like this international initiative where they take cameras and TV studios like into dance studios and they film morning rehearsal and they interview dancers and they talk about choreographers. And I've always loved dance, but I never felt like I had a sort of deep understanding of it until I saw this video of like a morning class filmed for World Ballet Day. And I'm like, wait a minute, they're like just practicing. And then I was like, wait, I know what that's like. I grew up in a family of football players. I know what it's like to have physical discipline and to go to practice all the time and to spend your entire life sort of single-mindedly pursuing like one thing and to be in these like self-selected elite spaces. I know exactly what that's like. I think I'm gonna write ballet dancers. And so it was really just realizing like that they are athletes and seeing them practice. And I suddenly was like, something clicked in my head, and I was just like, I see, I understand this world now in a way that I like didn't. In a way that I didn't before. Before I kind of idealized it, but once I sort of had an end, then it was just a matter of like during the research. So like watching lots of practice footage, listening to a lot of interviews, like reading a lot about dance and learning the vocabulary and the stuff, and then just reading a bunch of news about terrible sex scandals that have rocked the ballet world
Oh
in the
my
last
god,
15 years.
I know.
So it's a combination of like really meticulous research and then, learning to forget all the research so you can just kind of let the stories live in that space.
I love that, and I love that in the book, and Charles is experiencing his body breaking down, but to Lionel, his body is more amazing and flexible than any body he's ever seen. So there's like that weird kind of change that I think people go through when they're so physically gifted.
I mean, it was a lot of fun to write about Lionel looking at a hot guy at a potluck. And there's that line in the book where he's like, looked Charles had the kind of physical beauty that seemed only possible for famous people or people with large social media followings. Because there are people like that when you meet them and you're just like, you're too hot to have a normal life. So like, are you just like pre-famous? Am I meeting you in like a pre-famous mode of life? And then you like blink and two years later they have like 60,000 Instagram followers. Um yeah, I love that. I love this sort of the way that we experience our bodies being so different from the way that the world perceives our bodies, and like making a useful tension and out of that gap.
I love that. And believe it or not, that brings us to 8:30. I am shocked. This flew by. Hello again.
Sorry to jump on here and
Jump
end
in.
this amazing conversation. I would love for this to go on all night. I'm sure you all have better things to do.
Not really.
I certainly don't. But I think we should let our audience get to other things. Thank you again so much to both of you. This was really
Thank you, Brandon. You were just great.
Oh, this was a pleasure. This was such a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Community Bookstore, and thanks for talking to me, Adam. And thanks for coming, everybody. It's been such a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you both so much for being here, Brandon. Very excited about the book. Adam, always a pleasure. And to everyone at home, please remember to get a copy of Filthy Animals from our website. It's a beautiful book with great words inside. Please get a copy. And we hope you'll join us for another virtual event at Community soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Hey, thank you.